Hello, and welcome to the second part of the City on the Highway lecture. So, in the first part, I've been talking a lot about the process of suburbanization and the dominance of the car um, that has created a new type of architecture. And now, in this part, I start with a very exciting study, also very influential study by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, which is called Learning from Las Vegas. This is the book. So, Learning from Las Vegas is dealing with this new landscape that has emerged due to the dominance of the car, and the car is kind of conquering the market as the new mode of mass transportation. Now, everybody could afford a car, and that would be the way you drive around. So consequentially, there's also an effect that this has on the architecture, not only the roads but also the architecture next to the roads. And what Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown point out and analyze is how a new kind of situation emerges that deals with the communication between signs and people moving in cars. So this is a communication that works through symbols. It's called like symbiotic study, and this the study of science is quite interesting because it emerged without the influence of architects or planners or any kind of other like government direction. This is purely because due to the faster speed that people move now when they are in cars, you need to have a very bold and direct way of communicating with the people in cars, especially if you have something to sell. So the two architects were studying predominantly Las Vegas, and they are the Strip. And the Strip is this one street where all those entertainment functions and casino are located, and these need to have very direct communication with the car. So um, therefore, what you see emerging is this new kind of forest of signs, um, that emerges on the side of the road. Some of it functional, telling you how to drive, but a lot of them simply relating to consumer culture or entertainment. Um, and that's what you see here. So architects started to get interested in this phenomenon. It is purely market driven and not designed at all, but nevertheless they find an aesthetic beauty in it. And also this works as a cultural, like contemporary cultural study. So architecture now needs signs as a symbol for what is going on. So this is quite different from what, for example, Le Corbusier has been talking about when he talks about the architecture as a machine, right? Where each part of the machine should be truthful in the way that it shows how people use the space inside. And then these different like programs, these different functions in the building get materialized in the architecture. And the architecture becomes this kind of machine that Le Corbusier is talking about. So this is very different. Here, architecture has a symbolic meaning. Architecture becomes a sign. And there's this famous analogy where they started talking about architecture as like two options. Either it can become the duck or the decorated shed. So what this refers to is an idea that imagine that for some reason you sell ducks for people to eat, and let's say roasted ducks, and you want to advertise them and make it known, right? People need to know that you are selling those ducks to come and eat them. So then you have these two options. Either you build a very simple building like a box. It doesn't really matter what the architecture is like or the experience is like. It's just a simple box, and you have a huge sign on top that says ducks. So everybody knows who drives by, this is where you can buy ducks. So that's the decorated shed idea. And the other one is, if you sell ducks, you just build a building in the shape of a duck. And this banal symbol is good enough to attract people or to communicate with people moving on high speed in the car what you are selling in your building. Mm. And if everybody does this, a very chaotic world of signs and symbols starts emerging. So some examples of this, and with these signs and that symbolic meaning of architecture emerge also new types of buildings, new types of brands as well. Because now if people spend a lot of time in the car, the lifestyle changes, and therefore their needs change, and the need for a new type of architecture emerges. So specifically the motel is one thing that didn't exist before. So a hotel that lets you easily check in with your car. And the other one is the drive-by fast food restaurant. So this is also something that is unheard of before. The surge of the use of the car, a place where you can just conveniently drive up or even drive through and not even get out of your car anymore to get your food. It's a study from Kevin Wilson on the motel typology. So this is according to Wilson how this started. So relatively modest building at the side of the road, a little sign advertising, trying to make known that this is a place where you can stay overnight. And then over time this emerges into more commercially promoted and advertised brands. So the signs get bigger, and you also start having chains. So this has also something to do with people being more mobile. If people move regularly from one state to the other, one coast to the other, or generally over larger distances, and this was before the time of internet, of course, so you wouldn't really know what's a good place to stay. And in order to have some idea about the price and the quality that you get, and kind of the facilities that they have, brands would be very important, right? You would recognize a brand, and normally you would recognize a brand by its sign. So then if you see a certain sign, you know, this is what I can expect, and that would help certain businesses to thrive. Then there are motel chains. I think everybody also in Korea knows, even if it's just from movies. Big signs looking more like something you expect from a fair than from a motel. And then this is one of the first burger chains. So if you want to bring this back to the idea of the duck and the decorated shed, so this would be the idea of the duck, right? You have a White Castle burgers, and surprise, surprise, your architecture looks like a White Castle. Of course, this is cheaply built, and all those castle features are just kind of attached on without any functions, purely about the semiotic value of symbolizing what's inside, so people know what they get and they can consume. Right, here's some more examples of restaurant and motel typology. can also materialize in a more modernist architecture, but most of it started to be very much driven by the idea of symbolism. And also what you see here is that this takes up a lot of space with all the parking around and the street. A lot of the land use has been dominated by car in some way. Yeah, another example, this is one of the early McDonald's fast food restaurants, and it's probably the same for you as for me. It looks strange because there is a different type of branding that only came later when they realized that um, yeah, this branding and being recognizable helps. I always find it funny to see when you're driving on the highway with children. Somehow they seem to have a like sixth sense for McDonald's. They just see that roof. That even if you're in an area that you where you've never been before, you just see the roof and they demand to eat there. So, a clear sign that that symbolism works. And then there's also the department store. This is a picture of an old department store, more of the urban type. So in the urban type department store, you would still base the architecture on a different lifestyle. So here you would still believe that people park their car close to the department store and walk on the sidewalk. And on their way, they would go window shopping and become acquainted with products they might or might not want to buy. And there's some kind of relation with the sidewalk, with the slow movement of people walking, and the products that are advertised, and you might even get a glimpse on the inside. So that is completely different later. Now this is a new type of mall in the suburbs, and here the architecture hardly matters how it looks because everything is internalized, and you also see how land consuming this type of architecture is, right? So there's the big mall and then huge amount of parking all around it, normally just used for a third or even less. But all of it is needed because at the peak days you want everybody to be able to park and get in. So the way of shopping also changes, and with the way of shopping changes, like from the old downtown to the suburbs, but also the internalization of the shopping experience. Yeah, this has a huge impact on the architecture. So if you want to summarize, or if we just want to follow the ideas of Clausen and his critique on the suburbanization in the US, then this is always about kind of balancing the idea that this has been done predominantly through the market in the US, or what would have happened if a strong state agency would have developed the houses and made housing available. So this is difficult to judge because obviously only the more commercial type has been built in the US. And on the one hand, you can say it was successful because lots of people at the time of the baby boom could be housed in those suburbs, and they could be housed at rates or like at affordable costs. But yeah, then according to Clausen, this also was not at the most cheap or most affordable price. So there are also people that say this could have been more efficient and you could have gotten better facilities for the same price. But anyhow, this became also an export model, right? This has happened all over the world. And another part of Paulson's critique, or another dimension of his critique of that suburbanization, was that this has not been reaching everybody. It was only possible for those who could afford the car, could afford the mortgage, could afford the new house in the suburb to participate in this process and improve their living conditions. So what you see here then is this a process of suburbanization that has several phases, and in this process there's some kind of racial filtering taking place, whether that's intended or not, but often the ones that cannot afford to participate in that suburbanization process are predominantly colored or black. Okay, and from here we go to the next example, which is in Britain. After that, we have two other examples from Europe. So, Britain after the war, Second World War, also had to find solutions for the spreading urban regions, and in Britain they have been implementing green belts, similar to what you have in Seoul, right? And these green belts had three main effects. So first of all, they would contain the amount of land that is converted from rural to urban, and that means that you get less sprawl. You decide with these planning and regulations where you can build, where you cannot build, or what you can build. So land cannot get used at low efficiencies, but instead has to be more compacted. So the second one is suburbanization and the growth of growing separation of the new residential areas from the main employment centers. We talked about it before, right? How it's important that the places of living are well connected to places where you can work. So if this doesn't happen, then people have longer and longer commutes, and you get more like spatial separation. So this is a negative effect if this is not planned well. And third is inflation of land and property values on a scale never previously witnessed. So this comes with the idea of the green belt. If you contain the amount of land that is available, you make the remaining land more scarce, right? The demand is still there, still as many people want to live somewhere, but this amount of people now has to compete for less amount of land, and through market mechanisms we know that greater competition leads to higher prices. So that's also what happens when green belts are installed. Through this kind of policy of containing land, putting green belts, prioritizing more compact ways of building, the suburbs were very different in Britain and the US. On the right side you see typical Levittown in the US, the idea of the freestanding house with your garden, and on the left side that was in Britain, more of those compact developments similar to what we also know from Seoul and other East Asian cities. Yeah, again there's a kind of criticism actually on both approaches, that also similar to the US, also the British system hasn't managed to serve all people. Yeah, but then another criticism on the British planning system where you create high-rise is that in Britain a lot of people were against living in high-rises. So what is being said here is that in the US people would at least kind of enjoy their house with a garden, while we talked about it in an earlier lecture, often these compact dense developments would turn into some kind of social problem area, or sometimes even slum. Okay, but there's also good examples from Europe. This is from Sweden, and this has become model development for other cities as well, and it's actually in a way close to the idea that Korea has been employing with new towns, only that in Sweden they have been doing it on a much smaller scale. So this is the commuter town of Vällingby. So Vällingby is a suburb of Stockholm, and they developed this new area outside, developing agricultural land, and yeah, connected this efficiently to Stockholm with a new train line. And what they have been doing better than in most other precedents before is that they directly try to facilitate places of work in the suburb in Vällingby, so to avoid that this becomes a sleeping town, a commuter town. So now in Vällingby you would right away have convenient shopping areas and a high density area around the city center, and then from there on it would spread out in lower densities, and that's where the people would live. So this is an example. Stockholm would be down here, and then you have several stops on that commuter line, and each of those train stops becomes the center of this new development, Vällingby over here, and that's where the highest density is, and then it spreads out. So you're trying to combine the qualities of a dense city with kind of the suburb and the recreational qualities of that. This is in a more diagrammatic way, the plan. So this would be the city center with the highest density, and then you would have high density housing around it, lower density housing around that, and then still reachable for everybody, green recreational spaces. And it's funny to see, if you like remember the scheme of Howard's Garden Cities, then maybe this is not so far away, right? This is also connected to the main city with an efficient train network, and it's also in a fragmented way, seeing the city as a radial development, and also here the industry would be on the outside. So some similarities you can find here. An image of Vällingby, a city center, train line, high rise around. And what has been working quite well here is that you have pedestrianized center. So all of this is conveniently walkable, big parking lot here, and you would have places of work, places of living, and commercial facilities in the center. So you also avoid the problem that if everything is full of offices, it might be deserted in the late afternoon, early night. But if you also have housing and other facilities, then you can avoid that kind of problem. Then this is an image of the design. So here they're reverting to very clean, straightforward, modernist architecture. Also in a way symbolizing, the new, the rational, and so on. And like this, this is very different from the US and the shopping mall, right? Here you have the spaces outside, there's a communication between the building and the outside spaces, and the outside spaces pedestrianized. So in a way, it's reverting back to the qualities of the old city, if you want, where people walk and window shop, and the public space is not only for commuting, but also becomes a social space again. Yeah, some more images of the same thing. Landscape design, very modernist architecture. Then housing blocks. This would be the higher ones, right? And then after this come the lower ones. And yeah, as a assessment, what is being said, that what the good qualities of Vällingby are, is that here you have, yeah, the quality that people don't commute so much anymore because there are more jobs close. So here, men have more time with their children, and women and teenagers find it easier to get around without a car because it's planned to be more pedestrian friendly. And children had a better planned open space and special services. That's the same reason, simply because it's planned better. If you have a suburban development like here in the US, basically the space you have is whatever's on your land or space in the street, but there are hardly any communal facilities here, right? Also no diversity, no commerce, no places of work. Okay, and the last example for this session is Paris. Paris was also planning suburbs, kind of extensions of the growing city on a huge scale. So Vällingby was about 80,000 people, 80 to 100,000 people. And Paris was making huge kind of new towns, in fact, for 300 to 400,000 people. Yeah, here you see the growth of Paris, and then in the latest diagram you see these new towns emerging. Yeah, this is again a similar diagram with the main city Paris here, and then these developments outside. They are yeah, often connected to existing suburbs, but often also dominating them, overwhelming them. And then there's also these green spaces in between Paris and that new developed area, which creates distance between the two. So if you follow a little bit what is going on in Paris, or you sometimes watch the news, then from time to time you see that there are riots taking place. And often these are in the suburbs of Paris. So these are actually these developments. They haven't been very successful. Most people who can have enough money move out, and they have not been successful in being like an integrative part of Paris. And part of it is that it has been built in a distance, right? There has been this green buffer in between the main city and those new developments. Yeah, this is a model, first plan. So it's been planned with the best intentions. Planned to really provide good facilities, modern architecture. This is a idea about the high-speed rail that should connect the area to the main city, and this is a monorail. So they also give something special to this new suburbs, right? Implementing expensive infrastructure. It's also a thing to try to make it more attractive and cool for people to live there. Then streetscape. And this is how it worked out in practice. I mentioned before, right? In Europe, I don't know any country where people like high-rise. So for a lot of Europeans, this is too dense, too much. Now, after I lived in Korea for a couple of years, this is in a way cute. You know, this doesn't feel like too dense or too overcrowded. But this is like problems that it had to deal with. How people in France, also in Germany and other European countries want to live is this, right? Naja, and this is similar approach as to Vällingby. So there's this satellite city, and you would have different like urban agglomerations, and then a center with a new train line, and around that, yeah, the urban area, and different urban areas would be separated from one another with these green areas. So that works for recreation, but also prevents sprawl, and the idea that would create more of an identity of each zone. Yeah, same thing you see here again. So connecting new type of modern transportation, this new railroad to the old one, and planning the area as kind of archipelago of different urban areas, which in the end failed. This one I talked about, right? The monorail, a cool new type of infrastructure that should give some swag to the area, but didn't work. And also the architecture actually tried to be modern, experimental, interesting, and create something new with that like high density living, but it didn't work. So what did or does seem to work from today's perspective is this trend that we're having now, that more and more people are abandoning the suburbs, that the car gets abandoned more and more, that people despise the dominance of the car and reliance on the car, and want to live back in the city again. It's an image of the High Line in New York, where also derelict old infrastructure is being repurposed into a public park, and these old urban facilities that were just waste in a way before are becoming like very well liked part of the leisure landscape. And then we're back at this this cartoon where you see these different phases of suburbanization, where in the end the ones that can afford are actually moving back into the city and enjoying life in the dense urban center. Okay, thank you guys very much. This is the end of this lecture.